Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of On Air. Today I am joined by Conrad Ford. Conrad is the Chief Product Officer at Allica Bank, founder of funding options not in a previous life, in this life, but in a previous role as well, but now Chief Product Officer at Allica Bank. And we're going to be talking about a really interesting topic today. We're going to be talking about some of Conrad's learnings from multiple iterations, the last 3 startups of selling into SMEs. How do you sell into SMEs? What works? What doesn't work? What's the difference? And digging into that as a topic. First and foremost, Conrad, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. And how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Well, it's almost the weekend. I don't know when this is going out, but right now it's almost the weekend, which is always when I'm at my best.
Good, we've got you at your best. Glad to hear that. So we do like to dive into topic quickly on this podcast, but before we do that, we always give our guests 2 minutes, 2-minute deadline. And in those 2 minutes, I'd like you to cover who's Conrad and who are Allica Bank.
Yeah, so who's Conrad's? I'll go through my brief career. I spent the first decade or so of my proper career in banking, working in major banks. And then I made the fateful decision, which I call my midlife crisis, to found my own business. So I founded a fintech startup, financial technology startup called Funding Options, which I'm happy to say is still there in London with quite a few employees. So I was the sole founder of that business, and I scaled it up over 7 or 8 years. I stood down as CEO about 3 years ago. And a couple of years ago, I joined Allica Bank. So who are Allica Bank? Allica Bank is a new bank focused on what we call the established SME segment. That's what we call them internally. So these are medium-sized businesses, the M and SME. There's about 500,000 of them in the UK, and they're kind of chronically underserved by banks and in fact by non-banks. So the big banks find medium-sized businesses quite awkward to deal with. So it's, as we read all the time in the press, they don't particularly like to lend to them. In fact, they don't particularly like to give them any kind of service. And actually, it's also been neglected by modern technology providers who are very much focused on what are called micro businesses, is really small businesses. But our core segment of medium-sized businesses is actually a much bigger economic segment. It's much more important to our economy, and that's why Allica exists.
Fantastic, thank you. Within the 2 minutes, congratulations. Tick, we've passed that one. Let's get into topics. So we've chosen today to dig into some of the learnings that you've had about selling to SMEs. How do we sell into SMEs? And I want to start with just understanding, why is it important to sell in a different way to SMEs than it is to larger organizations?
Yeah, well, let me just start with why it's different to selling to consumers. I think that's a good starting point, because if you think about it, you very rarely see a TV advert aimed at the small business segment, the SME segment. And there's a reason for that, actually, which is there's about 30 million households and there's only a few million businesses. Therefore, any kind of mass market channel, in other words, just blasting out indiscriminately, you tend to get outspent by consumer. This is why, when we turn on our TVs and we watch the ad breaks of Britain's Got Talent, they're selling us washing up detergent. They're not selling us, is that a thing? They're not selling us small business services. So traditional sort of mass market channels don't work for the SME segment. At the other extreme, as you alluded to, there's large enterprises. Large enterprises, well, they're actually very hard to sell to, but each client is so valuable that kind of whoever is selling to them kind of doesn't care. It's very, very people-based. You're endlessly throwing account managers and account directors and all kinds of expensive people at this task of trying to actually influence dozens of people within a large organization to buy what you're selling. So what is special about the SME segment is kind of awkwardly stuck between those extremes. You can't, because the value you're going to get from an SME customer isn't massively more than a consumer in many cases. You can't afford to throw account directors and all the stuff you have within enterprise sales. Yeah. But neither can you go and just blast out TV adverts and hope that some customers will just naturally walk through the door. So there's a lot of nuance in selling to SMEs. And I think another challenge is that the person you're selling to, which is typically the small business owner, the owner manager, are extremely busy people. Yeah, statistically, the only people busier than them are investment bankers, the kind of people in the city that work 12-hour days and drop of a heart attack at 30. They're second only to that in terms of how hard they work. So it's really hard to get their attention, and it's actually really hard to get them to think about anything but kind of the current crisis in their business. And you and I both know this, right? You know, being a small business owner or medium-sized business owner is as much a crisis management role as anything else.
Yeah.
So it's actually really hard to get that headspace to actually sell them. So even though you might have something of huge value, how do you actually connect with them cost effectively is at the heart of that problem.
Really interesting. Do you know what? I don't think about consumer because I spent a career in B2B. It's so far disconnected, but I think it's a really valuable point. And many people move from consumer sales into B2B as well. I think there's something else in there around the fact that you're selling into somebody who's far more emotionally, personally attached to the outcome. So, you know, certainly running a small business as a founder, an owner, managing director, whatever you want to call it, director of a company, the money you're spending, there's a fine line between it being seen as a company's budget money and your money as an individual, particularly if you're a sole owner of a business. And then therefore that decision can be far more emotionally attached to the outcome than it might be logically or practically attached. And I guess that brings a whole different buying experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're bang on. And as you say, you know, for an owner managed business, it is their money, right? It's you know, for a bit of smoke and mirror with taxes, it's just as if they're spending money that they would spend on their household shopping. So that's absolutely it. And I think the emotional thing is really important there. I mean, it's one of the things that big banks, for example, get wrong with the medium-sized business or the small business segment is that, you know, you can read a lot of surveys about how small businesses feel about their bank, and they feel actually looked down on by their bank. Yeah. And you can kind of understand why it's painfully obvious if you're a business owner that you're the bank, the big bank that you're allegedly partnering with, they wish you were bigger. They wish you were Vodafone, right? Because that you know, that's where they can make real money in their minds. And you know, they kind of feel looked down on. They get, the computer says no. You know, they feel that, well, they used to have a relationship manager and now they get bounced around a call center. And actually, if you've built a business from scratch to multi-million turnover, you've done something that very, very few people have achieved or indeed can achieve. Yeah, you've got a lot of pride in what you've achieved, and to actually be looked down on, it really doesn't work. I read an amazing report that really, you read a lot of nonsense about the SME segment in consultant surveys, but there's actually a very good report called Small Misunderstood Businesses. And it actually is really good at sort of, it's got under the skin. They surveyed lots of businesses, got under the skin of how they feel, and they feel looked down on. And also the other thing that you commonly see is that you see so many adverts aimed at small businesses and medium-sized businesses, where they kind of have this imagery of a barista with a beard, you know, and you just know, yeah, that the person who wrote that advert is a Shoreditch hipster in a marketing agency. So when they think about a business, yeah, they're thinking about, well, it's those guys with, you know, big beards and baristas, and the average, you know, medium-sized business is actually pretty gritty, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's those estates we accidentally wander into sometimes when we're driving and have to do a U-turn. That's the reality of the small business, most small businesses.
Yeah.
So there's a real disconnect between how large organizations trying to sell to small businesses versus the reality. You know, the reality is, you know, small businesses are gritty, they're tough, and they have extraordinary ups and downs. Yeah. You know, I'm now a wage slave, having been a small business owner for a number of years, right? And the highs aren't as high if you're a wage slave, but believe you me, the lows aren't as low either. So it's a very, very different world being a business owner.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because even then, the examples that you see, so where you do see B2B advertising might be, you know, I see it from things like QuickBooks, for example, you know, the image that you gave me, the barista, that sort of stuff, that's the person they portray as a business owner. And you're right, because actually in there, you've got small accountancy firms, you've got people running a garage. But it's interesting that people go to the consumer play again. They give the examples of the people can understand, which is the consumer business. But there's a whole world of people that are starting B2B businesses out there, might have 10 staff, 5 staff, 20 staff, whatever it might be, 50 staff. And yeah, it's a really interesting mindset. And I think they're underrepresented generally in society and misunderstood. And I think it's a really interesting point that actually, when we think about how we sell into those, to stand back and actually consider consciously, what do I need to do differently? How do I need to behave? What are the triggers for those people? What are the challenges that they're facing, and how does that feel for them? There aren't many people in society that can do that. accurately, that have been in those shoes. So then empathy is very difficult, and of course empathy is so important in sales. So let's just move through the topic a little bit into well, then what have you learned? What does work selling into SMEs and what doesn't work? Maybe you could pick some things out for us.
Yeah, so a common challenge, I say, I mean, I work with quite a few founders informally, sort of giving them informal advice when I can. And many of those are actually selling, they're startups trying to sell into this segment. And something I see again and again and again is they're attempting to sell services to business owners that business owners should use or should be intellectually interesting to small business owners. So in the tech world, there's a love of creating dashboards for businesses, right?
Yeah.
Now, let me just make this real. I'm a qualified accountant, right? So I know in intricate detail how important it is as a business owner to forecast your cash flow, right? But believe you me, when I was running my own business, right, there were many periods when I didn't get round to forecasting my cash flow. So in other words, you're just, whatever firefight or client engagement you have just takes over your life, right?
Yeah.
Small business owners don't have time, generally speaking, to spend times on the important and urgent things in that sort of classic grid. So what we learned at Funding Options, we had a specific phrase for this. We talked about hair on fire moments, right? And what we meant by that is if your hair's on fire, right, you don't care about anything else, yeah?
Yeah.
You forget about your kids, your house, your mortgage, your dog, yeah? If your hair's on fire, all you care about is how do I put my hair out? And we found the early customers of Funding Options, when Funding Options began to get product market fit and really began to scale rapidly, we found that actually the customers that we had, so Funding Options were helping those businesses to get finance.
Yeah.
The early customers of Funding Options were ones that needed finance really quickly. So in positive circumstances, they might have won a large contract. More commonly, perhaps they would have realized they couldn't pay their staff on Wednesday because somebody else hadn't paid them, but they needed money really quickly. And it was those businesses that were willing to go through the hard yards of working with Funding Options, because it shouldn't be too easy to get money and it takes time to get money. They're willing to go through hard yards, and they were also willing to trust an organization that they hadn't heard of before. Now, every small business owner would have heard of the big 5 banks, but they wouldn't necessarily have heard of us. So you've got to be solving a really urgent and major problem for that business owner to have any chance of really cutting through. Now, over time, Funding Options built a brand presence, built some very sophisticated channels. So it was not, by the end of my time there, it wasn't always the case. But the reality is, to get the engagement of the small business owner, it's got to be really, really high on their engagement at that point, on their agenda at that point in time. Now, how has that kind of influenced my thesis of how you sell to this segment? Well, one of the nice things about the small business segment is there's tons of information available about your target customers. Yeah. Now, why does that matter? Well, let's look at a segment where that's not the case. Because of the famous GDPR, yeah, the amount of information available about the average consumer publicly available is very limited. Yeah, it's private personal information. But the average company, where you can find out their accounts, their directors, is all public information. Whether they've got a local authority contract is public information. Whether they trade internationally, it's all publicly available information. And that information is constantly being updated if you get it into a coherent format. So thinking about what Allica Bank do, one of the things we do is finance things like trucks and machinery for medium-sized businesses. Or what if we can actually look for signals that a business might have won a new contract? What if a haulage company has just won a new local authority contract and is likely to need some more trucks? What if you can talk about helping them to fund those trucks at that point in time? So using data intelligently to talk to the right businesses at the right time, for me, that's a really clever way of actually cutting through the fundamental problem that you can't afford to spend that much money on selling to a small business because the revenues coming from that business aren't very high. So using data cleverly, I think, is really important to my thesis.
Yeah.
And there's other related points as well. The rules around email outreach to small businesses. It's not, there's nuances. It's not the same as there aren't the same anti-spam laws, and in fact, many businesses are happy for you to reach out to them by telephone. And actually very engaging on telephone. So that's kind of lesson number 1, which is use data to talk to the right business at the right time. So, you can't do TV. So what about being a bit more clever about it? I think that's really important thesis and at the heart of what I'm the marketing engine I'm building at Allica Bank.
Really interesting. We talk a lot about relevancy, being relevant,
Yeah.
and I think if you can be relevant, there's a number of ways in which you can achieve that. So through data, you're able to be relevant and talk about the problem that's likely to be there at the right times. Timing relevancy, messaging relevancy. I think it's a really clever way of doing it, and a valid point that we're actually very lucky to be selling into SMEs. I think the other key point is that you know who the decision maker is. Selling into enterprise. I think it was Challenger that produced it. There's a Challenger Hubs that produces like 11.4 people involved in the average decision in enterprise.
And the worst thing is there's always another one. Yeah. So
someone you don't know.
You've been told about 11 and the deal's ready to be done, and the 12th comes out of the woodwork.
Well,
and
like any average, if it's 11.4 in one deal, there's 20, right? There's someone somewhere carrying 20.
I've done enterprise sales in my time, and it's not something I'd love to go back to.
No. And what a joy to sell into a company and to know who the right person to talk to is. It's a real luxury that you don't think of. But that again is a data thing, right? We've got the data, we know who's there, it's available to us. So I think a very poignant point.
But you know what? There is an important, again, a common mistake. And this mistake is actually just as true in enterprise sales as it is in selling to SMEs. Is this assumption that businesses are these sort of cold entities. So when you're selling to people, it's a warm engaged, consumers, it's a warm engaged person to person. But actually, I mean, this isn't just theory. This is empirically proven, right? Yeah. Businesses, they buy on emotion and they justify on fact. Yeah. Yes. So in other words, the human element really does matter, right? It's very easy to forget that you're not selling to a business, you're selling to a person in the business. And as you pointed out earlier, in the case of an owner managed business, the person and the business are inseparable. So the human element, and I'm sure you know this from your day job, many business owners are actually very, very receptive to someone reaching out and having a chat and actually openly listening to what someone's got to say about how that you may help their business with their services, right? So and having someone who's really strong with people is critical to selling into businesses, just as it is with selling into consumers.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And we talk a lot about what do you hire for a salesperson. I think that personality piece, that intangible ability to connect with people, ability to hold a conversation, communicate. If you have got that, you can learn how to sell, you can learn the process. If you haven't got that, it's very difficult with any process to get somebody to be exceptional. And I think, that's never more true than selling into SME. So very,
and you know the people, don't you? Because you walk into a team meeting and there's certain people that just give energy. And unfortunately, I'm not one of them, but I'm very envious of those people. That they're classic extroverts, right? They energize themselves by spending time with people, and those are the kind of people actually enjoy. Reaching out and talking to other people are brilliant in these roles.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just differentiate something, try to at least, between selling into SME and selling into enterprise. So other than the amount of people involved, your point before was around it's still an emotional decision, then we just justify it with logic, it's still going to be human. So do you think that the core defining factors of successful salesperson, not process, but person, it is the same in selling into SME and it's just a process change? Or do you think there are traits that perhaps suit you more to one than the other?
I think enterprise sales, you really need to have gravitas, which I think is something that's very hard to define, but it's one of those things that when it's there, right?
Yeah, it's on every job brief in the country for a senior leader, that isn't it? Gravitas.
Yeah, and it's very hard to put your finger on. It's one of those. Sometimes it's one of those concepts you feel slightly uncomfortable with, because it maybe has some background connotations. I don't know, but fundamentally, I mean, I am now an enterprise, right? I'm a senior executive in an enterprise, and I get sold to, and sometimes I do actually just feel. It sounds awful, but you've put a lightweight in front of me. This is, this isn't going to work, right? I've got someone that I don't feel can answer my questions, for example. So I think there is that. And of course, in enterprise sales, you're typically selling a very complex proposition or product. So, sort of turning on its head, looking at consumer, in consumer, if your elevator pitch isn't 30 seconds, in other words, if you can't explain what you do and why people should buy it in a 30-second Britain's Got Talent ad, give up and go home, right? There's no, in enterprise sales, right? if you've got anywhere in the sales process, you've got at least half an hour's time with somebody, right?
Yeah.
So you're explaining much more complex products. So I think that's but other than that, I think the fundamentals are still there, right? Which is that it's just as important for the medium-sized businesses as enterprise. You need to be good at building relationships. And I would also say that the enterprise sales, if you go back even like 10 or 20 years, there was a lot of kind of about relationship building, playing golf and inviting people to golf days. Like, I think some of the organizations we work with or are trying to sell to me to find it really uncomfortable. If somebody really wants to take me on a golf day, I'm crap at golf, I'll go on a golf day, but it will make zero impact on whether or not I buy or continue to use their service. These days, the kind of the objective basis on which you make these big decisions, there's so many guardrails that stop relationships from driving bad behaviors. But I think in that respect, enterprise sales actually evolved, certainly in my career lifetime.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting point. I'm also not that great at golf, so I tend to turn those down very regularly. I'm keen to just see if I can uncover some of the mistakes that you've seen or made along the way. Some of the things that, if people are listening to this and they're selling into SME and they're thinking, let me try and understand what I'm doing right and what I could change, what I could do differently. What are some of the mistakes you can pick out from your journey, whether it's things that other people have done around you, you've done within your organizations?
I mean, first and foremost, who you're selling to is far less interested in your product than you are, right? I think I do see this one again and again. And actually, there's a certain type of buyer of products. There's a very small segment that are typically called the early adopters, who are very intellectually curious. And actually, in your early days, you can meet a lot of those intellectually curious prospects, and then get into lulled into a false sense of security.
Yeah.
But effectively, you have far less time to explain your product, or actually more importantly, to explain the benefits of your product to a customer than think you do. If your kind of elevator pitch is more than 30 seconds or a minute, you've probably lost their attention. You just don't know it because they've started working on the keyboard again. And that kind of dovetails into the point I made before, but the really important one, which is effectively the stuff that a business owner should do that's important but not urgent, doesn't get done half as much as you think it does.
Yeah.
So again, they're not, the typical business owner, I don't think, is a particularly intellectually curious person. I don't for a second say that in derogatory way. They're people of action. Yeah. Who else would be crazy enough to go set up a business, right? I meet many people who've spent the last 10 years talking about setting up a business. They're intellectually curious people, but the sub-segment that actually go ahead and do it are people of action. So you really do need to cut to the chase. And then classic sales theory, which is a mistake made at all levels, enterprise downwards, is talking about the product. Yeah, you should talk about firstly, you should talk about the challenge that the business has. Yeah, and if that challenge resonates, talk about how you solve that challenge. Yeah, the product is not something you're selling, right? What you're actually selling is a solution to a challenge. And I have been sold to quite a few times along the way where people, they're just not listening, right? They just want to tell you about the product, yeah? And I'm trying to tell them why that's not a challenge I have, but these people might have a challenge. And I try and be helpful while I can, Like that might have a challenge, but they're just not listening. They just want to talk about their products, yeah? So in the end, coming back to my hair on fire point, for me or anyone in business to buy something, it has to really resonate that this is a major challenge for them right now. Yeah. And if it resonates, you've got a fighting chance they might actually listen to your solution.
So really, and that then brings me on to my next question around process. So we talk about the skills a salesperson needs. We talk about the ability to sell, to identify a pain point or a problem that they can solve. We talk about the relevancy using data. Talk about the interpersonal skills, the empathy, all those sorts of things. What about the process? Because not everybody says yes today. And, if my hair is on fire at the moment with a point X, the last thing I'm thinking about is buying Y, but I might still need it, right? There's still an argument to say on the right day, you might catch me in a mood where I go, yeah, actually, we need to do this. Today wasn't that day. And I guess that's where process comes into it. And I think it's often a step or a part of the sales cycle that the SMEs selling into SMEs particularly miss. They rely on the individual to remember to do this, remember to do that, pick it up. There's a hell of a lot of weight in getting a really solid, consistent process behind a good sales force, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the implicit in that is the evolution of CRM or CRM platforms, so customer relationship management platforms. So it's amazing how far you can go with limited technical understanding on some of the modern CRM platforms. And the reason I talk about CRMs is, you can't rely on yourself to follow up with a client because they said, this might be interesting in spring. Yeah. So in the case of us, right, I'm not buying a truck now, but I may be buying one in the spring, right? You must be putting that data into a store, and a CRM is a platform you put it in. So yeah. CRMs are really, really potent ways of task tracking, case management, making yourself follow up on people, automation of some of the basic follow-ups. So get yourself a CRM, and some of the newer and actually very, very affordable CRMs are really, really capable. It's been one of the great moves forward. When I was working at Barclays, I kind of had this growing thesis about what became known as SaaS, software as a service. And it kind of, largely speaking, turned out to be true, which is that large enterprises had this enormous advantage over small businesses in terms of the technology they used for a long time. They had stuff like CRM, which used to be a really expensive thing you installed on your desktop. And they had all kinds of technological capabilities, websites, etc. With the emergence of SaaS, you suddenly had those capabilities were available to small businesses for a few pounds a month. Yeah. And actually, because they were the second wave, they're in many ways more capable than the legacy platforms the big enterprises had. So if you're a business owner that's trying to sell particularly to other businesses, and you're not using some of this stuff, then you really are letting yourself down, because it can turbocharge your business, and it's not as complex or expensive as you probably think.
Yeah, do you know what? Embracing technology in the sales process is something that you see more and more, but there's still a big gap, isn't there? And we're past early adopters, we're into the majority now. And I think the late adopters are absolutely going to be 5-10 years behind. Really interesting point on that. I want to just touch on marketing, because having a CRM is great. Knowing when to focus on that is great. That motion is all focused on the salesperson, but of course there's a job to do. And I know you're involved in marketing, and as a founder, you'd have been across that at Funding Options as well. You've got to think about what can marketing do when you're selling into SME to contribute to that, and to lift the opportunity, or to nurture it as it's sitting, in that not now phase, but in a minute.
Yeah, well, I mean, first and foremost, it's very common, probably more common than not, for sales and marketing to be in opposition to each other. Yeah. So for marketing to be blaming sales that they can't convert good leads, and for sales to be blaming marketing because they're poor leads. Yeah. So first and foremost, you must find a way through that tension. And as I said before, I would say it's more often than not that's the case. But these two functions blaming each other for the overall targets being met. Yeah. In the end, I mean, Funding Options, I used to talk about smarketing, right? They're two sides of the same coin. Your revenue target is you've got the marketing and the sales, but basically together they deliver the revenue target. So coordination between those functions is absolutely critical. And that's a kind of constant constructive and iterative process. And the reason I use constructive is because, sales should be sort of politely feeding back, actually, that one's not right for us, and this is why. And if you have a really iterative feedback loop, then constantly you can basically just constantly slightly improve the targeting of your marketing. And you get this extraordinary output of certain incremental gains. So what is famously called the sales pipeline, or the sales funnel, which is the many steps from first contact with a customer through to them actually paying for something, the many steps in that funnel or pipeline. If you just add like 10% to each of those steps, then typically, because there's so many steps, you've actually doubled your revenue with lots of small gains. And actually, my time at Funding Options, I would say the sort of golden age for me is as the business rapidly scaled. We were more than doubling every year in terms of revenues for a number of years. It was always because every month we just found the extra 10% in each step of the pipeline. There wasn't some one silver bullet that unlocked everything. It was that we would experiment on this web page where people fill in a form. We found that we put our Trustpilot logo underneath it. There was a slight increase in our conversion, the number of people filling in the form. So it was these constant incremental gains. And the only way that happens is to have a really constructive feedback loop between sales and marketing. So in other words, rather than you're giving us crap leads or you guys can't convert, and just constantly just working together to actually just iteratively. If you get that right, it's so powerful. But unfortunately, most business cultures are actually quite adversarial and political. And if you can create a culture that's constructive and where people don't feel that they need to blame others for failure because everyone owns failure and everyone owns success together, then it can be really, really powerful. All the great companies, I think, have that.
Yeah, do you know, I love that phrase you used at the end of picking out the failure, but everyone owns failure. I think it's a really nice way of looking at it. You know, that's what you're looking for when somebody fails. Take ownership of it. It's okay. Let's take ownership of it and let's learn from it and let's move forward. And I think, yeah, that in itself is a really, you know, a really good takeaway from this. We're heading towards the end of the conversation. I'm keen just to give you the opportunity to just pick anything out that I've missed. Maybe I haven't asked the right question, or maybe there's something on your mind you're thinking, you know, there's another lesson that I've learned that you'd just like to highlight, or maybe you just want to give away some free advice to people who are selling into SME. Whatever you think works. I just don't want to leave anything on the table.
I guess the only thing we haven't touched on is, you know, I think many of us fall in love with SME as a segment. Yeah. If you told me that I would fall in love with SME, that was where I would choose to spend my career. Yeah. If you told me that when I was in investment banking, I would have found the idea slightly laughable. The reality is, right, you know, having actually run a business, you have such respect for the, you know, sheer grit and determination of the average small business owner. You know, the average small business owner. They're for those that remember the Rocky movies, right? Rocky was this boxer who basically, they wasn't the best boxer, but they got knocked down, they got up again, they always got up again, and eventually they got up and the other guy got punched down. And I think, you know, that is the reality for the vast majority of small businesses, that extraordinary resilience. I think it's a very satisfying segment to work with. And if you talk to the relationship managers, for example, that we have at Allica, you know, they love the segment they work with, right? They enjoy spending time with their customers, because these are amazing, resilient individuals. So yeah. I think it's a segment that people should actually consider more for their careers than many do. You know, people have these, you know, they want to go down to London and work with large corporates. It's like, really? Yeah.
The grass is always greener.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know what, that whole corporate thing, I've made a career of being an SME as well. It's something I enjoy, the speed at which things move, the ability to make a decision and change the direction of something, the lack of politics, red tape, all that sort of stuff. And you know, you live or die by your decisions, and you win and fail by the direct impact you have, versus potentially being a small fish in a big pond and being drowned accordingly. And I know that's not the case for everybody, but you know, I think it's about finding your fit, isn't it?
It is.
I think it's a really valuable point. Conrad, look, first and foremost, thank you for joining us on the show. Thank you for giving us your thoughts and the opportunity to learn from your experience. We like to just give our guests the opportunity to tell the audience who are listening or watching this how Allica Bank can help, who they can help, and how they can get in touch if they want to do that.
Yeah, so Allica Bank, we're a newish bank, but we're growing very quickly and now quite a significant scale. We're focused on what we call established SMEs, so the 500,000 or so businesses in the UK that have, you know, millions of turnover, but not hundreds of millions of turnover. What makes us different? We only exist for that segment. So, you know, you may feel if you bank with one of the famous big four high street banks, you may feel unloved, right? We love you. Yeah. And actually, you know, of course, everybody would say that. The reality is, right, we exist entirely for that segment. Therefore, we take it very seriously indeed. So, yeah, what can we help with? We can help with stuff like financing your property, your factory, your shop, your hotel, whatever it may be. For financing a business property, financing your business assets, machinery, trucks, etc. And very shortly, we're launching our current account, which is going to be amazing.
I was going to say, because the word bank suggests that's where I put my money as well. So you've got the banking side of it and then the lending side as well together.
Correct.
Nice. Fantastic. So how can people get in touch?
Allica.bank.
Fantastic. Nice, easy one. Love it. Conrad, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you coming on today. And as I say, thank you for giving us the opportunity to learn from your experience.
Brilliant. Thank you.